Joining us for more on this is Negar Mortazavi. She's a journalist and political analyst here in Washington. Negar, good to see you again. First, can you update us on the latest of the talks? These are indirect talks, I believe the fourth that have been happening. Where do things stand now from what you understand?
Sure. So we don't know too much about the details of the talks, except that they have been moving forward. They're sort of at the stage of working on the nitty-gritty of what form of sanctions are going to be lifted by Washington. There are around 1,600 sanctions and designations that have been imposed by the Trump administration, and Tehran's request was a removal of all sanctions. As our understanding from the talks, obviously behind the scenes talks, is that Washington has put them in three categories of sanctions that they're prepared to remove, sanctions that they're not prepared to remove, and then some in between sanctions that are more complicated to work with. So our understanding is that they're working on that last stage of what those sanctions are, and then also how Iran is going to agree to scale back its nuclear program.
Officials here in Washington recognized that the previous administration of Donald Trump made it more difficult for the current administration of Joe Biden to work with this agreement. But there are also tensions between the U.S. and Europe under Donald Trump. How are those panning out in these talks now between the Joe Biden administration and Europe? Are they seen as one side, one team, or is there still some space between them?
There's definitely more unison when it comes to the United States and its closest allies in Europe, the E3, the European three, Germany, France, and the UK, as well as the European Union, who's the coordinator of these negotiations. There was unison under the Obama administration. There was even more agreement between the US and Russia and China, who are not as close of an ally to the United States. And that there was a gap, increasing gap between them under the Trump administration. It's something that the Biden administration has been trying to change, especially with Secretary Blinken being a person who's more for multilateralism, especially collaboration with Europe on other issues, as well as diplomacy with Iran.
There were reports in Iran that President Hassan Rouhani was optimistic on Saturday ahead of the talks. What is the domestic view of these talks and the ability of the foreign minister, Zarif, and others to basically negotiate now that there seems to be perhaps mistrust? What is the view from the domestic audience there in Iran?
Sure. So the majority of Iranians, we don't have clear statistics, but from the past two presidential elections, we know the majority of Iranians were for this deal, for the JCPOA, for diplomacy, basically, with the West, Europe, and specifically with the United States. And they supported it. They supported President Rouhani's mandate. Now Iran is at a critical juncture because the presidential election is coming up in June, and it's the end of Hassan Rouhani's term. So there's a lot of infighting and these rivalries between political factions. And some of the hardline and more conservative factions actually don't want this return to diplomacy happen, at least before elections, so that their own person, potentially the next president, would be able to take credit for it after the Rouhani team is gone. So there's sort of that rivalry, but I think in general, the overall calculation of the state in Tehran is that they want a return to diplomacy. And there's that overall support for the Rouhani team and the Zarif team to get this deal done.
Negar Mortazavi, thank you as always for your insight.
Thank you so much.